am Dr. Silas Mordaunt, Associate Professor of Literature. Golding observed rather than invented Piggy. Golding observed Piggy. He looked at the world as it has been operating for 3,000 years, and he wrote down what he saw. He put it on an island with some boys in a conch, and he called it a novel about savagery. And it has been taught as a novel about savagery for 60 years, but it is not a novel about savagery. It is a field guide. It is a taxonomical record of a specific category of person and a specific category of outcome, documented across the full length of recorded human history, with a consistency so total and so regular and so unremarkable to the institutions that produce it, that the consistency itself has become invisible. And Golding made it visible, and the visibility has been making people uncomfortable since 1954. And I'm here today to make it more uncomfortable, and we're going to begin now. The thesis is this: Piggy is a documented historical phenomenon. He's not a type in the literary sense, not an archetype, not a symbol, not the sensitive outcast whose function is to make the reader feel the cost of civilization's collapse. He is a category, a repeatable, predictable, institutionally generated category of person who is correct about the critical matter at hand, who possesses the instrument required to address it, and who is destroyed by the room he is in before the instrument can be used. This has happened before Golding. It has happened after Golding. It is happening now in an institution whose names I will not produce at this time. And Golding, who worked in a school and understood with the intimacy of daily professional experience what institutions do to the people they cannot accommodate, Golding wrote it down, and the writing is so accurate and so complete that 60 years of pedagogy have had to work very hard to keep it contained within the category of boys on a beach. And the containment is itself part of the pattern. And I find the containment the most Golding thing about the novel's reception. Let's begin with establishing Piggy's credentials first, so we can move through this part quickly, because the credentials are not really part of the argument. It's a mere foundation. I just want the foundation to be solid, not decorative. So I'm going to lay this one down without any ceremony. Piggy arrives on the island, and within his first significant exchange, he identifies the critical priority. The other boys are running, making noise, performing the liberation of boys released from school onto an island with no adults. Piggy's not performing liberation. Piggy's taking inventory. He counts the boys. He proposes the conch as an instrument of democratic assembly. He identifies the need for a signal fire before anyone else has even thought about rescue. He understands from the first hours that the island is a communication problem. They are here, and the world does not know they are here. And the entire project, as all projects are, is to close that distance. And he's already identified the mechanism by which the distance can be closed. He is 11 years old, and he's done this before any other boy on the island has finished enjoying the fact that there are no adults. He's right about the fire. He's right about the conch. He's right about Jack from their first encounter. He reads Jack's hunger for power with the accuracy of someone whose entire life has required them to read that hunger correctly in order to survive it. He's right about Ralph's limitations, which he navigates with the diplomatic precision of a person who understands that being right is insufficient and that the right person needs a viable host if the right idea is going to function. He chooses Ralph. He manages Ralph. He provides Ralph with the intellectual content of every significant decision Ralph makes. He stands behind Ralph, but while Ralph receives the credit, because Piggy understands the island's social economy well enough to know that his ideas have a better chance of surviving inside Ralph's leadership than inside his own. And the understanding is correct. It is also a particularly heartbreaking piece of political intelligence, and I am not going to dwell on the heartbreak, but it exists. The relentless, documented, first page to last page correctness of a boy who was right about everything and whom the island destroyed anyway. This is the field guide's first entry, and it will not be the last. The glasses. Piggy's glasses are the island's only instrument of rescue. This has been processed for 60 years as character detail: the fat boy with the asthma and the glasses, the physical markers of the outcast, the body that the island's social economy immediately identifies as the wrong kind of body. And it's not character detail, it's the novel's central technical fact. The glasses, when angled correctly toward the sun, produce a focused point of heat sufficient to ignite dry wood. The ignited wood produces fire. The fire produces smoke. The smoke is visible from a sufficient distance, and it transmits the presence of the boys on the island to passing ships. So the glasses are the island's transmitter, and they're the only technology available capable of closing the gap between the island and the world that does not know that the island is inhabited. And they are attached physically to Piggy, and Piggy cannot see without them. And Golding made this choice deliberately. He did not have to make Piggy short-sighted. He did not have to make the glasses the fire's source. He constructed a situation in which the instrument of transmission and the instrument of sight are the same object, owned by the same person. And then he constructed a plot in which that object is taken piece by piece from its owner. The first theft is partial, one lens broken in the initial confrontation with Jack. Piggy can still see after the first theft, partially effortfully, the world halved and distorted. The second theft is total. Both glasses taken in the night raid, Piggy left completely blind. The glass is now in Jack's camp, producing fire for hunting rather than fire for rescue. The transmitter has been separated from its owner. The signal fire that could bring them home is now the fire that cooks the pig. And Piggy is blind, and the ship has passed. The separation of the instrument from its owner is the mechanism I want to name and carry forward, because it's not Golding's invention either. It is a documented procedure operated by institutions across recorded history, with a consistency that would be remarkable if it were not so routine. The pattern runs as follows. A person of unusual capability produces or possesses an instrument, a methodology, a proof, a technology, even a clarity of perception that the institution requires. The institution takes the instrument. It doesn't take the person. The person, separated from the instrument that made them legible and valuable, becomes simply the wrong kind of person, in the wrong kind of body, with the wrong kind of manner. And the institution, having extracted what it needed, has no further use for them. And they're left on the island, blind. Golding put this in a pair of glasses on a fat boy's face, and it has been on school syllabuses for 60 years. And it is a very precise account of institutional extraction, and perhaps the most in 20th century English literature. And it's been taught as a story about what happens when you take the adults away. The adults were never coming. That is what the glasses are for. That's what Piggy understood, and nobody else did. The signal fire was the argument that adults could be reached, that the gap between the island and the world could be closed, that transmission were possible if the instrument was used correctly by the person who understood it. The glasses at the bottom of the cliff are Golding's answer to that argument. They are his verdict on the island. They are his verdict on the pattern he observed across a career of working inside institutions and reading history and watching the same outcome repeat with the reliability of a natural law. Cassandra first, because Cassandra is where the pattern enters recorded history, because Cassandra is where the pattern announces itself with a clarity that everything subsequent will confirm. Nothing will refute. Cassandra was given accurate prophecy. This is the myth's foundational premise. It was not a proximate prophecy, not an intuition toward prophecy, not some kind of prophecy that requires generous interpretation to be called correct after the fact. It was accurate prophecy. She said what would happen, and what she said would happen happened. Troy will fall. The Greeks are in the halls. Agamemnon will be murdered on his return. She was right about all of it, specifically in advance, with evidence available to anyone willing to look at the evidence, and nobody looked. And Troy fell, and Agamemnon died. And Cassandra was taken as a slave and murdered in Agamemnon's house on the same night as he died, which is the myth's final and most concentrated piece of information about what the pattern does to the person who embodies it. The curse is not the prophecy. This is the point that the myth has been making since well before Golding was born. And the myth's reception has been declining to absorb. For the same period, Apollo took Cassandra's credibility. He ensured that the instrument worked and that nobody could receive its signal. And the separation of the instrument from its reception is the same separation Golding put into the glasses. And it was old when Golding used it. But it was old when the myth codified it as well. It is the pattern's most ancient and most honest formulation. The signal is real, the transmitter is functioning, but the receiver has been turned off, and the turned off receiver is not a technical failure. It's the institution's choice made in advance about what signals it will receive and from whom. Cassandra's name has become a word. We use it as shorthand for the person whose warnings are ignored and subsequently vindicated. And the word is so familiar that it has stopped carrying the weight of what it describes. I want to return briefly to that weight. I want to put that weight back there. She watched Troy burn. She was correct about the horse and the Greeks and the fire. She watched the fire from inside the city she had tried to save, and was then taken in chains to a foreign house where she was killed. The myth does not give her a rehabilitation. It does not give her a final scene in which the Trojans who dismissed her acknowledge the accuracy of her warnings. It gives her chains and a foreign house and a death on the same night as the man who enslaved her. And this is not a tragic ending in the literary sense, it is just another entry in the field guide. It is the pattern stated in its most concentrated form. And everyone that follows it in the field guide is a variation of this entry, more specific and more documented, but not more extreme, because the myth had the honesty to take the pattern to its logical conclusion. And the logical conclusion is Cassandra dead in a foreign house, with nobody to acknowledge that she was right about the horse. Galileo Galilei is a canonical case. Everyone knows Galileo, and the field guide's utility depends on the cases they don't know. The sun is the center, the earth moves. He was correct, and the institution was wrong. And he was made to say otherwise, and spent his last years under house arrest. And the telescope he built to show people the evidence is now an instrument of children's science museums. The canonical case is useful because it establishes the field guide's credentials with an audience that might otherwise resist the pattern. But the canonical case is also the field guide's most diluted entry because Galileo was not destroyed in the way the pattern typically destroys. He recanted. He survived. He was wrong to recant, and the recantation worked. The working of the recantation is its own entry in the field guide, under a category I will not open today because it would take the rest of the episode. The point about Galileo is not his survival. It is the fact that the most powerful institution in Europe spent 30 years trying to make a man say that his instrument was lying. The instrument was not lying. And the effort required to suppress the signal tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the institution understood what the signal was transmitting. Giordano Bruno did not recant. Bruno went further than Galileo. Infinite universe, multiple words, the sun, one star among many. and he was burned in the Campo de Fiore in Rome in the year 1600. His name is less well known than Galileo's, and the lesser fame is the field guide's comment on what recantation purchases. Galileo recanted and has a museum. Bruno held and has a small statue in the square where they burned him. I note this without editorializing because the field guide does not need to editorialize. Semmelweis. Ignaz Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician working in Vienna in the 1840s who noted that the mortality rate in the maternity ward staffed by medical students was significantly higher than the mortality rate in the ward staffed by midwives. He investigated. He found that the medical students were coming directly from performing autopsies to delivering babies without washing their hands. He proposed that something on the cadavers, he didn't have germ theory to name it. Germ theory, in fact, did not yet exist, but something was being transmitted to the mothers and killing them. So he introduced mandatory hand washing with chlorinated lime solution. The mortality rate dropped from 10% to 1%. The medical establishment did not adopt his findings. His superior dismissed them. His colleagues rejected them. The journal that published his data published simultaneous rebuttals questioning his methodology. He was not given the position he had earned at the Vienna General Hospital. He left Vienna. He continued to publish. He wrote increasingly desperate open letters to the leading practitioners of Europe, calling them irresponsible, calling them murderers, because they were washing their hands before surgery now, but not before delivering babies. And women were still dying, and he had the data. And the data was being ignored, and the letters became more desperate, and the desperation was received as evidence of instability rather than as evidence he was correct and watching people die because of a professional culture that found his evidence inconvenient. He was committed to a mental asylum in 1865. He died 2 weeks later, possibly from the kind of infection he'd spent his career trying to prevent. Lister published The Germ Theory the following year. Hand washing became standard practice. Semmelweis was not there to see it. The field guide records this entry under the following heading: correct, data available, colleagues informed, methodology sound, outcome preventable, institution unresponsive, subject destroyed, practice eventually adopted, credit distributed to subsequent figures who operated in the theoretical environment the subject created. This is the scientific piggy's standard entry. It will recur. Ludwig Boltzmann proved that matter was made of atoms. This was not in the 1870s and 1880s an accepted position. The dominant school of thought in European physics held that atomic theory was a useful mathematical fiction rather than a description of physical reality, and the dominant school of thought was led by Ernst Mach, whose philosophical objections to atomic theory were sophisticated and whose institutional power was considerable, and whose personal campaign against Boltzmann was sustained across decades with an energy that Boltzmann's biographers have found difficult to explain on purely intellectual grounds. Boltzmann developed statistical mechanics. He provided a mathematical framework that not only described atomic behavior but predicted thermodynamic properties with a precision that the macroscopic physics of his opponents could not match. He was attacked. His papers were rejected. His university positions were contested. He spent the last decade of his life in a condition that contemporaries described as severe depression, and that the field guide describes as the psychological condition of a person who is correct about the fundamental nature of matter and is being told by the people with the institutional power to define what correct means that he is wrong. He died by suicide in 1906 whilst on holiday. Einstein published the paper confirming atomic theory the following year. The field guide notes the timing, 1 year. Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift in 1912. The continents were once joined, they moved. The evidence was in the coastlines, in the fossil record, in the geological formations that matched across oceans too wide to have been crossed by the organisms whose remains appeared on both sides. The geological establishment rejected the proposal with a thoroughness that the subsequent history of plate tectonics has made look, in retrospect, like one of the discipline's less distinguished periods. The mechanism was the objection. Wegener could describe the fact of continental movement, but could not explain what force was moving the continents. And the absence of a mechanism was used to discredit the evidence, which is a methodological reversal that the field guide notes as a recurring institutional maneuver. When the evidence cannot be refuted, refute the explanation, and treat the absence of a complete explanation as equivalent to the absence of evidence. Wegener died on the Greenland ice cap in 1930 on an expedition to establish weather stations. He was 50 years old. Plate tectonics became the unifying theory of geology in the 1960s. He has a crater on the moon named after him, which is the kind of posthumous recognition that the field guide classifies as adequate for everyone except the person receiving it. Georges Cantor developed the mathematics of infinity, multiple infinities, the infinity of real numbers larger than the infinity of natural numbers, a rigorous set theory that provided the foundations for subsequent mathematics in ways that are still being mapped. His colleague, Leopold Kronecker, spent years attacking him, calling his work a corruption of mathematics, calling him a corrupter of youth, using his institutional power to block Cantor's appointments and publications. Cantor spent the last 30 years of his life in and out of psychiatric institutions. He died in a sanatorium in 1918. The mathematics he developed is now foundational. The field guide notes without comment that Kronecker is remembered primarily as the man who attacked Cantor. Srinivasa Ramanujan arrived in Cambridge in 1914 from Madras with a notebook full of mathematical theorems of extraordinary depth, produced with almost no formal training, which he had sent to G.H. Hardy after 2 previous Cambridge mathematicians had declined to respond to his letters. Hardy recognized immediately that he was reading the work of a genius. The collaboration that followed produced mathematics that mathematicians are still proving correct a century later. Theories that Ramanujan stated without proof, apparently from intuition, that subsequent mathematicians have spent careers verifying. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1918. He died in 1920, aged 32. Of tuberculosis, contracted partly from the conditions he lived in during the war years in Cambridge, where food was inadequate and the climate was wrong, and the institution had not fully considered what it meant to bring a man from Madras and give him a fellowship and leave him to manage everything else himself. The field guide notes that the notebook he left behind, the one that sat in the Trinity College library for decades, the one that was found and opened in 1976 and found to contain theorems that mathematicians had not yet developed the tools to prove, is called the Lost Notebook. This name is the field guide's comment on what institutions do with what they are given before they understand what they have been given. Barry Marshall. Marshall believed that peptic ulcers were caused by bacterial infection. The accepted position was that ulcers were caused by stress and excess stomach acid, a position that had produced a pharmaceutical industry of considerable size and a clinical consensus of considerable confidence. And yet Marshall had a petri dish of H. pylori and a set of patient biopsies and a statistical correlation that he presented to his colleagues, and that his colleagues received with the skepticism that the field guide has learned to identify as the institution's preemptive defense against evidence that would require it to reorganize. He drank the petri dish. He infected himself. He developed gastritis. He treated it with antibiotics and it resolved. He published. He was ignored for several more years. He and Robin Warren received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2005. The field guide notes that the Nobel citation described the discovery as unexpected, which is the field guide's favorite kind of word, the word that institutions use to describe the thing that was expected by the person who discovered it, and unexpected only by the people who had decided in advance that it could not be true. These are the scientific piggies. The pattern in each case is the same pattern, operated by different institutions in different centuries with different instruments of suppression, and the same outcome. The signal was real, the transmitter was functioning, the institution turned off the receiver, and the fire went out, and the ship passed, and the glasses are at the bottom of the cliff. And somewhere between 1 year and 30 years later, the institution adopted the finding and distributed the credit to the theoretical environment rather than to the person who created it. And the person was dead, and the field guy recorded the entry. And the entry looks exactly like the previous entry and the one before that. And Golding read the entries and put them on an island and called it a novel. And the novel has been on school syllabuses for 60 years. Of course, we're not finished. The cases I've presented so far share a particular mechanism of destruction, which is disbelief. The institution encounters the signal and declines to receive it. There is a second mechanism, distinct from the first, that the field guide records under a separate heading, and the heading is theft. The instrument is not merely ignored, it's taken. The fire is made from the stolen glasses, and the person left blind is not the person who failed to see. They're the person who saw most clearly, and the clarity was the instrument, and the instrument was taken, and the theft was not recognized as theft, because the institution does not have a category for taking from Piggy. Taking from Piggy is not theft in the institution's vocabulary. Its allocation or the sensible distribution of resources to the people best positioned to use them, where best position means positioned within the institution's existing power structure. And of course, Piggy is not positioned within the institution's existing power structure, and so the glasses go to Jack, and the fire burns, and it burns for the wrong purpose, and Piggy is blind. Rosalind Franklin. In 1952, Franklin produced an X-ray crystallographic image of DNA that her colleague Maurice Wilkins showed without her knowledge or consent to James Watson. The image, known as Photograph 51, revealed the helical structure of DNA with a clarity that Watson later described as making his mouth fall open and making his pulse begin to race. Watson and Crick used the structural information in the photograph to build their model of the double helix. They did not tell Franklin they had seen her photograph. They published in Nature in April 1953. Franklin published her own data in a supporting paper in the same issue, not knowing it had already been used to build the model it was supporting. Watson, Crick, and Wilkins received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1962. Franklin had died of ovarian cancer in 1958 at 37. The Nobel is not awarded posthumously. And the field guide notes that Watson's account of the events published in 1968 under the title The Double Helix described Franklin in terms that the field guide does not reproduce here, and that the scientific community has spent 50 years trying to distance itself from without fully confronting what they reveal about the room Franklin was working in, and what the room thought of the person whose instrument it was using. The glasses produced the fire. The fire was not used for rescue. Emmy Noether. Emmy Noether was described by Einstein as the most significant mathematical genius thus far produced. This is Einstein's assessment, offered without qualification, of a person who spent the first decade of her career being barred from official academic positions in Germany because she was a woman. She audited lectures because women could not formally enroll. She completed a doctorate she was not officially supposed to be working toward. She lectured at the University of Göttingen for years under David Hilbert's name because women could not hold academic titles, which meant that students attending her lectures were formally attending Hilbert's lectures. And Hilbert was aware of this and Noether lectured under his name because it was the only available mechanism for her ideas to enter the institution at all. She was eventually given a title. She was dismissed from it when the Nazis came to power in 1933 and she fled to America. And she died 2 years later from complications following surgery. Noether's theorem, which describes the relationship between symmetry and conservation laws in physics, is the mathematical foundation of modern theoretical physics. Every physicist working today is working in the house that she built, and she lectured under someone else's name for years to get the materials into the room. The glasses again produced the fire, and the fire was not used for rescue. Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin. In 1925, Celia Payne-Gaposchkin completed a doctoral thesis at Radcliffe College in which she proved through spectroscopic analysis of starlight that stars are composed primarily of hydrogen and helium. This was not the accepted position. The accepted position was that stars had a composition broadly similar to Earth's. Her data said otherwise. And it said it with the precision of a person who had looked at the evidence with a kind of careful and sustained attention that produces findings rather than confirmations. And her supervisor, Henry Norris Russell, one of the most influential astronomers of the period, told her that her conclusion was clearly impossible and that she should add a disclaimer noting that the result appeared to be spurious. She added the disclaimer. And 4 years later, Russell published the same finding, that stars are composed primarily of hydrogen, on the basis of his own subsequent analysis, and he received the credit, and Payne-Gaposchkin's prior proof was a footnote. Russell later acknowledged her priority. The acknowledgement is in the footnotes of the histories of the period, which is where the field guide has learned to look for the names of the people who were right first. The glasses again produced the fire, and again the fire was not used for rescue. And Phyllis Wheatley, in 1772, a committee of 18 prominent businessmen, clergymen, merchants, the governor of Massachusetts, convened to determine whether a black enslaved woman could have really written the poems attributed to her. The poems did exist, and they were good. But the committee had apparently decided in advance that their goodness exceeded the range of what their author could have produced. So this examination was the institution's mechanism for resolving the discrepancy between the evidence and the assumption. Wheatley appeared before them and answered their questions. It was found, by the committee's judgment, to have been capable of the poems. She was manumitted the following year. Her book was published in London. She died in 1784 in poverty, aged 31, her later work largely unpublished, her first book largely unread in the country that had required her to prove she had written it. Her field guide notes that the examination, the convening of 18 men to determine whether the instrument belongs to its owner, is the pattern in its most naked in documented form. The instrument was there, the owner was there, but the institution required a committee to establish the connection between them. And the committee deliberated, and the connection was happily established. And it made no practical difference. And she died at 31 in poverty. And the poems are good. The glasses produced the fire. Again, the fire was not used for rescue. Roger Beaujolais. He knew the O-rings would fail. No retrospective assessment here. It's not the kind of knowing that gets reconstructed after the fact by people who found patterns in the wreckage. Beaujolais knew before launch. He knew in specific, documented, evidenced way that an engineer who spent years working with a component knows when the component has reached the boundary of its operating parameters. He knew in July 1985, 7 months before the launch, when he wrote a memo to his superiors identifying the O-ring erosion problem and stating in writing that it was potentially catastrophic. He knew on the evening of January 27th, 1986, the night before the launch, where he and a small group of engineers participated in a teleconference with NASA and argued for a launch delay. The temperature at the Cape the following morning was forecast to be significantly below the O-ring's tested operational range. Beaujolais had the data. He presented the data. He argued from the data with the directness of a person who understood that the data was describing a fatal outcome and that the directness was therefore not optional. NASA's response, delivered through the teleconference, was to ask for proof that it was not safe to launch. Hold on to that for a moment. The national standard, the standard that any rational risk assessment requires, is to prove that it is safe to launch. The standard was reversed. Prove it is not safe. The reversal of the standard is not a technical error. It is the institution's mechanism for managing the gap between what its schedule requires and what its evidence permits. And the mechanism is to move the burden of proof onto the evidence and away from the schedule. And once the burden has been moved, the evidence is always insufficient. Because evidence of a risk that has not yet materialized is always incomplete. And incomplete evidence against a schedule is always going to lose to a schedule, and the schedule required the launch, and the launch was approved. And Beaujolais sat the following morning, he sat and watched Challenger disintegrate 73 seconds after launch. And he was subsequently marginalized by the company he tried to save. His colleagues stopped talking to him. His position became untenable. He developed post-traumatic stress disorder. He left the company. He spent subsequent years lecturing on engineering ethics and whistleblowing and institutional dynamics that produced disasters that the available evidence predicted. And the lectures were good and well received. He knew what he was talking about with the authority of a person who had the memo and the teleconference notes and the 73 seconds. And he's not a household name, and Challenger is. Beaujolais' memo of 1985 is one of the most precisely predictive documents in the history of engineering failure. It describes 7 months in advance the mechanism by which 7 people will die. It was received, filed, and not acted upon. The institution had the signal, the institution had the transmitter, the institution had the glasses in its hands and looked at them and put them down and launched anyway, and the fire burned for the wrong purpose, and the ship did not come. John Snow mapped the dead in the summer of 1854. 600 people died in the Soho district of London in 10 days. The accepted theory of transmission of cholera was miasma. The disease spread through bad air, through the smell of filth and rot, through the atmospheric corruption produced by London's inadequate sanitation. Snow did not believe in miasma. He'd been developing an alternative theory, waterborne transmission, since the 1849 outbreak, and the 1854 Soho outbreak gave him a concentration of cases in a small enough geographic area to test it. He went door to door. He mapped every death. He marked each one on a street map of Soho, and the marks clustered around the Broad Street water pump with a density that the miasma theory could not account for. He found that workers at a brewery on Broad Street had not contracted cholera. They drank beer rather than pump water. He found that a woman in Hampstead, far from Soho, had contracted it, and she had previously lived near the Broad Street pump and had sent for water from it because she preferred its taste. He presented his map to the Board of Guardians of St. James's Parish. They removed the handle from the pump. The medical establishment did not adopt his theory. The removal of the pump handle was a local and pragmatic response to an immediate crisis, rather than a theoretical concession. The miasma theory retained its institutional authority for another 20 years. Snow died in 1858, about 4 years after the outbreak, before the germ theory had provided the mechanism that the institution required before it would accept the evidence. He was 45. The Broad Street pump now has a memorial plaque and a pub named after him nearby. And the field guide notes that memorial plaques and nearby pubs are the institution's standard retrospective acknowledgement of the person it declined to listen to while they were alive and in the room with the data. Rachel Carson published Silent Spring in 1962. The chemical industry responded with the resources of an industry that understood correctly that the book was an existential threat to its operating model. Carson documented the effects of synthetic pesticides, DDT, specifically on bird populations, ecosystem, on the food chain, on human health. The documentation was meticulous. The sources were scientific. The argument was constructed with the care of a writer who knew that the opposition would be well-funded and therefore had to make the evidentiary standard of her work as high as she could possibly make it, which is the move of a person who has correctly assessed the room she's entering and has prepared accordingly, which is the piggy move. The preemptive fortification of the argument against the attack that is already being organized. The attack was well-funded and sustained and personal in ways that the field guide has learned to identify as the institution's acknowledgement that the argument cannot be refuted on its merits. She was called hysterical. She was called a spinster. She was called a communist. The chemical industry hired scientists to write rebuttals and distributed them to media outlets and government officials, and produced a volume of counter-arguments sufficient to create in the public record the impression of a contested scientific question, when the scientific question was not, among scientists who have read the evidence, meaningfully contested. Carson testified before Congress in 1963. She was dying of breast cancer during the testimony and did not disclose this. Her composure before the committee was the composure of a person who has one remaining thing to do and is doing it. She died in 1964. DDT was banned in the United States in 1972. The bald eagle population recovered. She did not see it. Walter Pitts was 23 years old when he co-wrote with Warren McCulloch the 1943 paper that provided the logical and mathematical foundation for neural networks and, by extension, for the conceptual architecture of artificial intelligence. Before this, he had been a runaway teenager who had taught himself Greek to read mathematical texts in the original, and had written to Bertrand Russell about errors he had found in it. And Russell had invited him to Cambridge. And he had not gone to Cambridge, and instead he ended up at the University of Chicago and then MIT. in the orbit of Norbert Wiener, who was building cybernetics, and Pitt's contributions to this project were, by the assessment of the people working alongside him, foundational in ways that his formal position, again, no degree, no academic title, he existed in some kind of accredited genius without portfolio, did not reflect. The destruction of Walter Pitts was personal rather than institutional in its mechanism, which is a variation the field guide records because the pattern does not always operate through committees and journal rejections and reversed burdens of proof. Sometimes it operates through a single person with sufficient institutional power to remove the scaffolding that is holding someone up. Norbert Wiener cut off contact with Pitts in the early 1950s, and the cutting off was not private but institutional. Wiener told his wife not to allow Pitts into their house. Wiener stopped collaborating with Pitts. Wiener's influence in the field was such that the withdrawal of his support was the withdrawal of the architecture within which Pitts had been able to function. Pitts burned his unpublished work. He drank. He died in 1969 at 46. In circumstances that his contemporaries described with the particular helplessness of people who watched something happen that they did not know how to stop. The paper he co-wrote at 23 is cited in the foundational literature of artificial intelligence, and his name is less well known than the field it helped to create. Nikolai Vavilov was the greatest plant scientist of the 20th century. There's no contention to that claim. He led more than 100 expeditions across 64 countries, collecting plant specimens and crop varieties, building at the institute he directed at Leningrad, what was at the time the world's largest seed bank, a repository of agricultural biodiversity that he understood with the clarity of a person who had thought carefully about food security and famine and the genetic resources required to breed crops capable of feeding populations under changing conditions, to be among the most important scientific collections in existence. He was right about this. He was right about the genetic basis of plant breeding at a time when Soviet agricultural policy was being reorganized around the theories of Trofim Lysenko, who rejected Mendelian genetics as bourgeois and idealist, and whose theories of acquired inheritance were scientifically indefensible but politically convenient and therefore institutionally dominant. Vavilov argued against Lysenko. He argued from evidence, from the genetic theory that decades of subsequent biology have confirmed, from the data of his own breeding experience, from the seed bank whose existence was the material proof of what plant genetics could do. He argued in the specific way that a person argues when they are correct and the institution is wrong, and the institution has the power to define what correct means. He was arrested by the NKVD in 1940 on charges of espionage and sabotage and wrecking, which are the charges the Soviet institutional apparatus produced when it needed to remove a scientist whose findings were inconvenient. He was sentenced to death, commuted to 20 years in a labor camp. He died in Saratov prison in 1943, dystrophy, which is the medical term for starvation, which means that the man who spent his life collecting seeds to end famine starved to death in a Soviet prison. The seed bank in Leningrad survived the siege of the city during the Second World War because the scientists who worked there refused to eat the seeds. And several of them died of hunger while sitting in a room full of food that they would not consume because it was Vavilov's. And the field guide records this without comment because the comment would be insufficient. I could go on. I could go on. I could go on and on and on and on. Fire is for hunting. The ship has passed. The glasses are at the bottom of the cliff. Golding wrote Lord of the Flies. In 1854, he'd been a teacher. He had also served in the Royal Navy during the Second World War and had seen in the specific way that a person sees things when they're present in a war and paying attention what human beings do to each other when the institutional constraints that ordinarily manage their behavior are removed or corrupted or simply inadequate to the pressure being applied to them. He came back from the war and taught in schools and wrote a novel about boys on an island. The novel was rejected by 21 publishers before Faber accepted it, which the field guide notes as the pattern operating on its own creator with a predictability that Golding might have found either validating or exhausting, and that the field guide finds simply consistent. The novel Golding wrote is not about savagery. It's not about what happens when you remove the adults and let the children run the island. It's about what the adults built before they left, and what they built it to do, and whose interests the building serves and whose it doesn't. The room is not a collection of savages. It's the institution. There's rules and hierarchies and mechanisms of credentialing and processes for determining whose voice carries weight and whose doesn't. And the processes are not random. And the outcomes are not random. And Piggy is not an unlucky individual. Piggy is a category. He is the category that Semmelweis is in, and that Franklin is in, and that Vavilov is in, and that Beaujolais is in, and Cassandra is in, and the field guide has been filling with names since before Golding was born, and will be filling after the last copy of Lord of the Flies has ever been read. The conch is the institution's promise to itself that it will listen. The conch says, the person holding this has the right to speak. The conch says, the instrument of assembly will be honoured. The conch says, we have built a system, and the system will be respected. And the conch is held by Ralph, who did not build it, and it is broken when Piggy is killed. And the breaking is not an accident. And it's not the product of unconstrained savagery. The breaking is the moment where the institution stops pretending that the promise was ever going to be kept for Piggy. The conch was always going to break when Piggy held it. The institution built the conch. The institution knows who the conch is for. The rock falls. The conch shatters. Piggy falls. And then the naval officer arrives. The officer arrives on the beach and he finds boys in war paint and a dead boy in a burning island and Ralph weeping. And he takes in the scene with the mild, slightly disappointed attention of an authority figure encountering a situation that falls below the standard he expected. And he straightens his uniform. He's standing on a beach where a child has been murdered and the island is on fire, and he straightens his uniform. And the straightening is the most precisely observed detail in the novel. And it's the most damning because the straightening is not callousness and it's not evil. It is professionalism. It's an officer of an institution responding to a situation according to the institution's procedures, and the institution's priority in this moment is wrong. And the officer does not know that it's wrong, and not knowing is what makes him the naval officer and not the villain. He does not ask about Piggy. The officer's ship is an instrument of rescue, and the rescue operates on the living, and does not account for what produced the dead. And the island burns behind the ship as it leaves, and the signal was never received, and the institution has arrived too late for everything except the paperwork, and it's straightening its uniform. The reading of this novel that has persisted for 60 years is this. Remove the adults, and this is what you get. The boys are savage because there are no adults. Piggy dies because there are no adults. And if you return the adults, if you restore the supervision and the authority and the civilizing presence of the grown-up world, the savagery stops, and the fire is used correctly, and Piggy lives. Semmelweis had adults present. The adults were doctors. The adults had degrees and titles and the full institutional authority of the Vienna General Hospital behind them. And they watched women die of infections that the data on Semmelweis's desk told them how to present. And they did not wash their hands. Vavilov had adults present. Stalin was an adult. Lysenko was an adult. The NKVD officers who arrested Vavilov were adults, and they were professionals. And they had procedures. And the procedures were followed correctly. And Vavilov starved. Rosalind Franklin had adults present. Watson was an adult. Crick was an adult. Wilkins was an adult. The adults looked at her photograph and used it and did not tell her and collected the Nobel. And the adults were present for every moment of it. Roger Beaujolais had adults present. The teleconference on the night of January 27, 1986 was conducted entirely by adults, credentialed and professional and experienced adults. And the adults decided to reverse the burden of proof and approved the launch. And Challenger was 73 seconds. And the adults were there. They were there. They have always been there. And they straightened their uniforms. The officer at the end of the novel is the point. Here's the world that produced the island. And the island is what the adults built. And the boys did not import the savagery from some pre-civilizational darkness inside themselves. The boys learned it from the room. Golding knew this. He put it in the novel on every page. And the curriculum takes the novel and calls it a warning about what children do without supervision, which is the institution taking the instrument and using it for the wrong fire. Piggy's glasses are at the bottom of the cliff. The adults put them there. I am Dr. Silas Mordaunt, Associate Professor of Literature. This concludes the first season of this series, which I began under conditions I will not revisit, and am ending under conditions I have not yet fully assessed. 12 primary texts, each one knew something. Some of them knew something about me specifically, which was not requested, which I'm still processing, and I will be attending to that before I return. And when I return, the scope of this series will be expanding, because it has become clear to me that the argument does not stop at the edges of the canon, that depth is not literature's exclusive property, and that there are places I've not yet looked that are very likely looking back. I now suspect that the questions worth asking do not confine themselves to places the Academy told me to look. I intend to follow them wherever they go. The glasses are at the bottom of the cliff, and I am going to find out what else is down there.